Okay. Good evening and welcome. My name is Roberto Damiani. I'm an assistant professor here at Daniels and the editor of The Architect and the Public on George Baird's contribution to architecture. Tonight, I will be the host for this evening's Daniels talk that will officially launch the book. Before introducing the format and guests for tonight's event, I welcome our Dean, Rob Wright, to give the land acknowledgement.
First, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Daniels honors Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those on the lands from which you are joining us virtually today. I would also like to add something to George Baird from me personally. George, you have made a significant contribution to the foundation of the architectural intellect and imagination internationally in Canada and to me personally. And I cannot thank you enough, George, for the contribution you've made to this faculty for over 5 generations of students. Roberto, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. So The Architect and the Public on George Baird's contribution to architecture is a collection of essays and interviews by an intergenerational group of 19 voices of architects, critics, and George Baird's former students, including Pier Vittorio Aureli, Adrian Blackwell, Peter Eisenman, Kenneth Frampton, Michael Hayes, Bruce Cabara, and Lars Slerup, just to mention a few of them. This group came together to discuss Baird's theoretical work in connection with his teaching and design practice. Working across several media and cultural contexts since the late 1960s, Baird, now Professor Emeritus at Daniels, has played a significant role in North America and beyond in shaping our understanding of architecture's public appearance. I would like to mention that the book has received the general support of the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts in Chicago, and in many different ways, it's connected to the symposium George Baird, A Question of Influence, held in 2012 at Daniels and organized by Francesco Garofalo, Bruce Cabara, and Richard Sommer. Now our tonight guest. With us, we have Joan Ockman, architectural historian and faculty at the University of Pennsylvania, Richard Sommer, professor and former dean at the Daniels faculty, assistant professors Michael Piper and Hans Ibelings, Andrew Choptiany, architect and Carmo di Gork in London and Baird's former students here in Daniels, and Brigitte Shim, professor, founding partner of the Toronto-based Shim Sutcliffe Architects and Baird's long-term colleague at Daniels. Tonight's format will be a conversation to present some of the topics discussed in the book, like Baird's political arguments on public space, his ability of bridging multiple modes of practicing architecture in connection to several geographies and intellectual networks. And last but not least, Baird's pluralist thinking in today's troubled political and social context. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A section of the website. So I would like to start maybe with Joan Ockman and say that your essay is part of the first section of the book that recognizes the political nature of public space as Baird's key contribution. In particular, your essay discusses the city as Baird's preferred political ground through a comparison with two other key urban thinkers like Roland Barthes and Walter Benjamin. Can you tell us more about how did the city move to the core of the architectural debate in the late 1960s, and how Baird's political urban thinking relate to Benjamin and Barthes?
Okay, thank you very much for this invitation. I feel very, I guess I should say, special to be the outsider here to some extent. I know some people are coming in from other places, but my connection to the University of Toronto is really as a guest, and I'm very pleased to be here. I also want to congratulate the school and you, Roberto, and especially George Baird on this marvelous volume, which truly situates his career, his contribution in a way that I think will be very lasting, and it's full of interesting stuff. So Roberto, you asked me to talk for maybe 5 to 10 minutes. I'm going to keep this very short. There are a lot of us here, and it's a little difficult to summarize the argument of my essay in that time. The title of my essay is "The City According to Baird, Benjamin, and Baird." Of course, the alliteration of the names was irresistible. But in addition to that, I also wanted to focus on Baird and Benjamin in particular, especially in as much as George Baird's relation to Hannah Arendt has been explored a lot, or is known and is further explored in this book in very illuminating ways. So I guess one of the questions that occurred to me as I was beginning to think about these two other intellectuals to whom Baird is absolutely explicit about his own indebtedness and relationship, I wanted to explore their theories of urban reception and apperception of urban experience in relation to what I've always understood as Baird's connection to design, to urban design, and to think through whether it's possible to make that leap. George Baird himself acknowledges his own proclivity for a kind of hybridization as opposed to a sort of faithful channeling of a point of view. And of course, he has the license to do that and does it brilliantly. But I thought I would try to sort through their theories in relation to one another. And this leads to a little diagram at the end of my essay, which attempts to sort of sum things up. And as I said, it's either too complex or just too complicated to rehash or rehearse here. But I thought I might begin by just posing a very provocative question, which is whether public space can actually be designed. And by public space, I mean space that is shared in common by an urban public. And I wonder, again, as a kind of provocation here, whether public design or urban design isn't in some ways a contradiction in terms, at least with respect to the lineage of Roland Barthes and Walter Benjamin. And in other words, isn't the very concept of publicness dependent on a space that is not scripted, not top-down, predetermined, and therefore not architected? And I pose this as a little bit of a devil's advocate argument, but I hope we can talk about the contradiction that is implicit in this. And in fact, in maybe continuing the provocation, in line with my failure to summarize my own argument here, I thought I might make reference to yet another theorist, in fact, another Torontonian, but one that I think can be related to these other three thinkers, and that's Jane Jacobs. And I want to tell you my favorite statement by Jane Jacobs ever, is her definition of a city, of a great city. And for Jane Jacobs, she says, a great city is a place that you can buy a secondhand violin and keep a mistress. I always found the second part of that statement a little funny, coming from a woman. And on one of her late trips back to New York from Toronto in the early 2000s, when she was receiving an award and giving a lecture, I had the chance to ask her what she meant. And she laughed and said that actually that statement was not made. She was quoting it from Oskar Stonerov. Oskar Stonerov, you may know, an architect who was associated with Luke Hahn, based in Philadelphia. Yeah, but obviously it had to be a man that would make such a statement. But I think we understand what she meant, that a city is a place of serendipities, of surprises, of unpredictability, a place where you can get lost and also find yourself, a place where you can keep secrets. And that kind of city, I think, is quite close, even though they seem like strange bedfellows, to Roland Barthes' idea of the amorous dimension, or what he calls the erotic dimension of the city, in a further development of his thinking, an essay titled Semiology and Urbanism that he writes in 1967. And as I state in my essay, I think that had George Baird and Charles Jenks known of that essay at the time they were putting their collection together, meaning in architecture, they might well have chosen to include it. But in any case, the erotic dimension of the city is an idea that has to do with the city as a place of encounter, of meeting the other, of engaging with strangers, with difference. And that kind of event produces pleasure, even jouissance in Barthes' meaning of that idea, which he elaborates in his book, The Pleasure of the Text, but also potentially knowledge, new knowledge. And that is where I think Barthes can lead us to the ideas of Benjamin, for whom the city is also a place where a new understanding of social relations, of city as a space of power dynamics, of, again, differences, and of interrelations occurs. Anyway, in a nutshell, those two ideas of city are related almost as positive and negative, because for Barthes, the city is this place of pleasure, while for Benjamin, it's a much more suspicious place. It's a place where his own sort of melancholy emerges in the context of these relationships, which are not necessarily good relations. And that leads to his theory of distraction, of the city as a backdrop, as a kind of wallpaper for our lives, as a lake that we're all swimming in, an ecosystem, if you like. And here's a connection back to Jane Jacobs again, who also understands cities this way, rather than a focal, or what George Baird talks about as a focalized set of conditions. In other words, of architecture, capital A. Architecture is lowercase by Benjamin. It's the built environment that he's trying to understand how it seeps into consciousness, how it leads to awareness, knowledge, and possibly even revolutionary politics, a new kind of praxis. So those are the questions that have to do with how cities are experienced, that I then try to gauge in relation to George Baird's idea of action. For Baird, there is a spectrum that goes from distraction to action. He tries to hybridize Benjamin's theory of distraction with Hannah Arendt's theory of action. But my argument, or my provocative question again, has to do with whether distraction and action are actually polar conditions or related in a different way. In other words, for Benjamin, distraction seems to be so much about differences, interstices, places that kind of escape the grid. Benjamin is very indebted to ideas of Georg Simmel, of Siegfried Kracauer, his contemporaries, or Kracauer is at least. And Kracauer makes a beautiful statement that I want to quote here and think about in relation to everything I just said, or ask you to, which is that, I'm quoting, "The value of cities is determined by the number of places in them that remain open for improvisation." So for all three, Kracauer, Benjamin, and Barth, I think it's fair to say that the city at its best is a realm of freedom. It's a realm of possibly improvisation, of discoveries that are not already predetermined. And again, from that standpoint, I simply want to raise the question of design. How does the designer, how does the architect produce a city that is open to improvisation? City air makes free, in the famous statement by Goethe. How does urban design allow for, produce, enable freedom? I think that's a fundamental question. I think it's a question that is important for Baird, and I think I'm interested to understand how we can put architecture and freedom together. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Joan. I mean, in my kind of sequence I was thinking that maybe either Michael or Richard, since you are both interested in the city, you can maybe keep again speculating about how this relationship between city and freedom, city design and freedom can work together, and how what Baird's contribution is about this relationship between, again, city design and freedom. Michael, Richard?
I
mean, in your conversation, Richard,
I could talk for the rest of the night about the questions that Joan has raised. skip the other questions. But let's start with Siegfried Kracauer, who I've strangely been thinking about lately in relation to another set of issues. But and remember that one of his great contributions is he was a, correct me if I'm wrong, Joan, he was a kind of early film theorist, right? So he was really writing about this emergence of the film as a spectacle and the mechanization of human experience. And so his characterization of the city is counter to a kind of emerging, very mechanical way in which film and media were beginning to replicate, the production line. And he would compare, for example, wasn't the Rockettes, which was it, Joan? It was some, mechanized swimming in films to the spaces of industrial production, right? And speaking about then comparing this to the potential of cities to open up a different kind of space that is less connected to the kind of, shall we say, the enslavement of the human body, right? And I think this is what Joan's getting at by raising this issue of freedom and what that means in terms of the political body. Am I right?
Kracauer is he is a film theorist, and he devotes a lot of his writing to reviewing films, and later writes a book called From Caligari to Hitler and all that. But the idea in the 1920s, and especially when he's so close to Benjamin, has to do with the moment when Hollywood film is starting to become hegemonic, and Hollywood, wants to suture everything. It wants a seamless you know, experience rather than a broken up disjunctive one. And Krakauer defends the multimedia kind of cinema, the early cinema in which, you know, which is a silent film, but there's, you know, piano player and there's a set design, and the theater itself is a whole kind of event that's full of attractions and distractions, and as against this kind of totality. And of course, we're in a moment when fascism is rising also, and both Benjamin and Krakauer are very fearful of this kind of totalization, and what Benjamin will talk about is aestheticization. And so the maintaining the disjunctiveness of the medium is very important for him. And in that sense, the city is a kind of prototype for the new medium of film. And Benjamin echoes that in his work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. So film and architecture very much are being thought through together, but in relation to an idea of disjunction as opposed to totality or seamlessness.
So yes, it relates to theories of montage and collage.
Yes, yes, cutting, right.
Bringing an additional, you know, Toronto figure, Marshall McLuhan, and the kind of emergence of the revisiting of these questions. This is the period more of George's formation in the late 1960s, when McLuhan would talk about media as being hot or cold, and hot media was media, you know, a little bit akin to what you're describing, which was prescriptive, which was closed, which is in some ways manipulative, whereas other, I think it was, if I get it right, cold media was something was much more open to interpretation and manipulation. This relates to all of what was happening in the, I think more frankly in art than in architecture in the 60s, with happenings and with a kind of return to this kind of multimedia way of creating a space which was open to possibility, right? Everything from happenings to Andy Warhol's factory, right? So I think this relates very much to the intersection, these questions of popular culture, these questions of modes of representation, and how they are very much bubbling up during the period when George and his generation are trying to put their ideas together in the 60s and 70s. Are we answering your question, Roberto?
Yes. The idea was actually to see how Baird was sensitive.
I want to just you know, in the question that Roberto's raised, I'm going to raise this issue of the sort of city suburb, like where this space is. So we'll get into that.
Yeah. Okay. Michael, since we're talking about suburbs, do you want to maybe tell us more about what drew you to Baird's work, so to see? Can you tell us more about what did you find interesting in George's work?
Yeah, thanks, Roberto. Maybe in part in response to your first question that Joan raised about the relationship between freedom and design. Actually, this has a lot to do with what drew me to Baird, George, excuse me. So specifically, the essay that I wrote had a lot to do with the idea of agency, which George drew in part, you know, from his thinking about Hannah Arendt, and the idea that somehow citizens should play a part in the production of the city. And George was kind of keenly, at least according to, you know, 3 essays that I was particularly fond of that George had written over about a 40-year period, I found a kind of keen interest that he had in trying to figure out how designers actually engage that idea of agency. So almost exactly what, you know, Joan was raising. And it's a super complicated question, of course. You know, agency is basically individuals, you know, doing things spontaneously without being told or without being designed how to do them. And there's, of course, a pleasure in cities that are produced kind of spontaneously. And so I think George, over the series of essays that I'd mentioned, you know, thought about the idea of kind of a form of urban design that wasn't about kind of producing fixed forms, but was rather kind of about producing frameworks for change and for human action. And so in the context of North America, particularly, that framework had a lot to do, not only with the establishment of infrastructure, but with the process of kind of land subdivision and property. And so my essay has a lot to do with the idea of the parcel and how it shows up in George's writing. And of course, a kind of first thought is to say that, you know, property and private land ownership is regular or rarely associated with the idea of kind of progressive politics. And I think what George was trying to do was to sort of separate that kind of negative connotation that property somehow is against the public good, and was trying to figure out how, you know, property, when thought of in abstract, could be a tool for enabling people to, you know, to interact with the city. And so this idea that urban designers, through configuring kind of land subdivision, but also as people who work with how land is regulated through, you know, planning policy and urban design regulation, have something to do with the rules that kind of set up the production of built form in cities. And so that idea that urban design is somehow playing a role in the kind of abstract procedural process of regulation and the kind of game-like quality of North American city building, I was always drawn to in George's work. And yeah, I found particularly his efforts at kind of finding a realist approach to design. So engaging the kind of difficult issues such as property, not as a kind of hindrance to some of his ideals, but rather as a mechanism through which to realize some of them.
So Michael, in that sense, the use of the term agency is really about how architecture achieves a degree of political power.
Well,
agency is a form of power.
It's tricky. I mean, so like, you know, agency, you know, is it the agency of the architect that we're talking about, or, you know, the agency of citizens? Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting because there's kind of two aspects. I mean, I think those are parallel conditions. Like, an agency for the designer in this context isn't about determining spatial configurations, but an agency is about enabling others to have agency, which is kind of a complicated idea. But
I think to appreciate Baird's original kind of themes and approach to agency, I think it's extremely important to situate Baird in the discussion that was happening around these themes in the 70s. So I think right now, maybe talking about agencies can sound not so kind of fresh or not so new, but in the 70s, when, if we think about, for example, Colin Rowe and Peter Eisenman approaching architecture in a much more top-down approach, this idea of agency, it was completely new and completely original. So I think in order to appreciate Baird's thinking, we need also to relate his idea of agency in the context of what was happening in North America in the late 70s and early 80s. So I think that's why I think it's, maybe Michael, you want to say something about what, because your essay does also an extremely good job at reconstructing the cultural context and the discussion around urbanism that Baird was part of in the transatlantic exchange between Europe and North America.
Yeah, I guess like there's a kind of methodological aspect to it in terms of research, which had to do with certain methods that were kind of getting exchanged between Europe and North America at the time, specifically, you know, ideas of morphology and typology. You know, so seeing as how these practices reemerged in Europe in the middle of the 20th century, in large part in response to the tendencies of modernist planners and designers to kind of try to create replace the existing city. European designers sought morphology as a way of kind of understanding the existing built form of the older city as a way to argue for its continued presence. I think George's unique contribution to this discourse and this method of thinking was that when that kind of practice made its way to North America, it came less about sort of understanding the existing city and more about kind of prescribing an ideal based on a European context. So North American morphologists were adapting European ideals and sought to kind of apply them to the North American city. And what George thought was, you know, actually, or I'm speaking for George here, sorry, George, if you're out there. But actually, we should be looking at the city just like the Europeans are. They weren't extracting a kind of ideal for the city, but rather they were studying the existing city. And so he applied that idea to the context of kind of diverse property ownership that was typical in the context of Toronto at the time.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And I think maybe from this point of view, we can also, I think George's unique approach is in his ability to also bridging between different modes of practicing. So observing the city, writing about the city, teaching about the city, it's something that was also extremely unique. And I think it's something that came with this new generation of architects and urban thinkers who saw also in the city something that pushed them to reconsider completely the way in which they approached architecture and the practice of architecture. So I think maybe, and in this regard, I think, Richard, your long conversation with George touches upon this new emerging figure of the teacher practitioner. And now this figure emerged from the late 60s where academia was very different and the professional scene was changing. So we have this kind of, again, new emerging figure of the teacher practitioner who play a key role in also in kind of influencing the next generation of young architects like you. Maybe you want to talk about this figure that you identify as the teacher practitioner.
So we're going to question 2 because question 1 was a continuation on the city and public.
Yeah, we're moving, freely.
Because I have notes for both.
Yeah. We can also, I think maybe we can shift towards more kind of, we can maybe go back to Baird's idea of the public. Maybe I think it would be also interesting to see how to discuss how George introduced this kind of new, it's not a new approach, but it's a different approach to how to practice and how to understand and write about cities.
Okay, so I'm going to try on the fly here to combine my responses to both those questions. Roberto sent us all questions, and the question I thought I was going to respond to was a little bit of a follow-up to what Joan was talking about this notion of publicness. So let me try and weave the two together. This question about architects and their the sort of the focus on the city, which I think Michael was just referring to, which was at the time I think thought of as a kind of repudiation or a response to a kind of modernist view of the city, or a kind of modernist planning view, which viewed the city in very abstract terms that emerged in the late 19th century with this kind of elevation of the idea of space in a kind of a very abstract way of organizing the city around questions of efficiency and industrial production. So the movement we're referring to from the 60s and 70s is in a way a return to, how shall I put it, the real geography or the topography of the city as it exists, rather than the one that was projected to somehow fix the problems of the laissez-faire city of the 19th century. So the generations in the early 20th century were very concerned with, congestion and, with all of the kind of chaos that was brought by the rapid changes. And then very quickly was seen by people like Jacobs and others that this abstract planning ethos was sort of disconnected, or could be very corrosive to the idea of the public nature of the city. So one of the problems in doing all this is A, what we're calling publicness, B, what we're calling the city, and what lies at the heart of this is how architecture conceives its relationship to politics. And just to take a little digression here, of course, at this very moment, I was speaking with Joan about this before we started, we see in the political situation in the United States that there is a very extreme geography actually to the politics of the city and of let's say citizenship, where There's a divide between the rural and the urban. There is a divide between the class divide to some extent within these geographies. There are some ethnic divisions, and I was saying to Joan that my last mailing address in the United States is where she lives in Pennsylvania, right outside of Philadelphia, Montgomery County, and they're counting the votes there in a place that was always a little bit more integrated than the rest of the United States, but has become a lot more, this is right outside Philadelphia, more ethnically and class integrated than it was. And this may end up deciding that one of the places that, along with where Michael's from actually, in Atlanta, may end up deciding who's going to be the next president of the United States. So geography matters, I guess, but what I guess this digression is really to say that one of the struggles of this period, and one of the disconnects in a way between the European and the scene in North America, is the site of what we're calling the city and publicness, because architects and planners, progressive left-leaning architects and planners, were very, very focused on recapturing or reinventing or saving the traditional centers of cities, which were seen as the seat of culture, and in some ways demonizing the new territories, which are the suburbs and outside of that. And we're very much, you know, when I went to school, this coming back to your first question, Roberto, you know, how this idea of architecture's engagement of the public and a kind of opening up to a broader array of phenomenon influenced me, how George influenced me as a teacher and a thinker. My interest in architecture started first with interest in music and film and literature, kind of in that order, and only later in architecture, and in these kind of those things as popular forms. You know, the films of Roberto Damiani, the new wave music, all sorts of music, and I was particularly interested in those bands, for example, that like Jonathan Richman or even the others that they wrote about the everyday condition of life in the city. That was the subject matter of popular culture, or even more far-flung things like the Grateful Dead and the Merry Pranksters, who were part of this, people who reenacted the travel across the great terrain of the United States, and said that they were acting against the so-called pioneers and moving from the West Coast back to the East Coast in reverse order. I mean, so these are people in popular culture, Ken Kesey, who are very conscious of the kind of politics of the city and the history they operated in, and the intersection between narrative and fiction and fact. And these are all things, I think, that were in my own mind when I started to study architecture, and they were very hard to reconcile with the sort of arguments about autonomy that were being forwarded by all the people that were my teachers. And in the ideological wars that George was involved in, the IAUS, and actually Joan, when she was just a baby, where the kind of pluralistic idea of engaging everyday life in the city of people that, to some extent like Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, were seen as too complicit with the wrong kind of politics. And on the other side, the kind of autonomy of Eisenman and Hayek and the white architects, and in Europe, Aldo Rossi, were seen as the proper political path. So this is, I'm going a lot of directions here because I wanted to get to what you asked me originally about, Roberto, which is the sort of ideological debates of the time and how they relate to an architecture of public life and the city, and what side all these architects that were at least generation ahead of me came down on, and how one sorted through that, how one tried to reconcile an interest in a kind of more pluralistic, let's say, democratic art form, and the arguments that were being put forward by architects of the day. So that brings me, and we'll come back to this because you have another question, and I want to hear from others, to this question of the other question that I concentrated on, which was the role of the teacher practitioner, the person that is basically
it's almost,
yeah.
Through George, I think it's almost like by studying George, by studying also other architects from more or less the same generation, it became almost clear to me that in the late 60s, a new architect, a new figure emerged. And this figure was maybe a response to the need of addressing the city and to the need of addressing politics in a different way. And this architect was a writer, was a teacher, was a professional practitioner who didn't really set for himself or for herself boundaries between these different multiple modes of practicing architecture. So George was writing and then was preparing reports for the city and then was teaching at the same time. It's almost like there is this kind of interconnection and an attempt to bring all these modes of practicing together that makes it extremely exceptional and also unique to understand a very specific moment in architectural history when this figure of this almost like a public intellectual architect emerged. And I think both you, John, and Richard, you experienced that. Maybe you experienced the rise and fall. So, but I think it's something that was pretty unique and pretty exceptional, and George represented this.
Well, I tried to be provocative in my discussion with George and ask him and pose the question whether that was a kind of whether this idea of this teacher practitioner was a bit of a myth. It was certainly a myth that I believed and that I and many of my peers tried to emulate. Right. The architect is a public intellectual, someone who could move between academia, public life, and practice. And I guess our discussion, the discussion I had with George that summer was, how did that work, right? And because it's certainly something that exists in other professions where people move through this way, and architecture has had some trouble with it. But I guess what I was trying to get at with people like Eisenman and others who took this as a model is, I think it was complicated, and I'm going to stop here because I like that. I think it was complicated actually by their politics and their inability to articulate a role for architecture's real publicness or its real engagement with civic politics through their insistence on architecture's autonomy.
Thank you, Richard. I think maybe just to stay on this note, I think your essay, Andrew and Hans, actually describes George as a cultural mediator between so many different geographies and different cultural contexts. Maybe can you help us to draw almost like a map of this of Baird's intellectual connections and exchange?
I would like to leave that to Andrew because we wrote this text together. And so if he can start, maybe I can chime in. He did most of the work actually for the article. So he's the main author. So I think he deserves.
Thank you very much. And thanks, of course, for the original invitation to write the piece. Yeah, I think we focused a lot on different media that George was using. And this concept of teacher practitioner is quite interesting. But I think even stepping back from that, it's almost this question of abstraction versus particularity. And I think with George, a lot of what defines his career is his attention to particularity and yet his interest in abstraction. So he is equally as interested in Hannah Arendt as he is in zoning bylaws. And I think as well as that interest in particularity, it's the decision to move to Toronto and to really focus himself on Toronto that defines much of his career. For a long time, he was a contemporary and working with and compared to Rem Koolhaas. And in many ways, they've had equal influence on architectural culture, but in completely different ways. In one of his introductions, he talks about how Rem became one of the most famous and most influential architects and architectural thinkers in the world, while I devoted most of my time and effort to a more local career in Toronto. Now, I think in many ways, it's this idea that he took critical regionalism and really ran with it in a way that was really quite admirable. Whereas Rem is talking about SML-XL, which is contextless, it's based on size rather than a place, or even in Delirious New York, he's almost celebrating the anonymity of many of the city blocks. George, his huge contribution is looking at, again, building code and the very specificity of Toronto. He comes and writes on building downtown, which, as much as it is a design guide for the city, is also understanding Toronto to a ridiculously detailed degree that many people hadn't really done before. Again, to Michael's point, that he was taking a form of analysis that was a more European context and bringing it to a completely different and very, again, local context. Now, what's amazing about that, I think, and in some ways to Joan's point, this idea of trying to create freedom and design, I think his ability to understand the infrastructure of a space is the challenge of architecture. We have all these amazing ideas, these amazing philosophies, but applying them to a built material and a very specific material is incredibly difficult. Whereas he was able to create, as Michael called it, a framework based on his understanding of the city and allowing for spontaneity, for improvisation within that by understanding the city so incredibly well. So to come back to media and to these different forms of media, I think that there's another type of book which they came very close to with their book Vacant Lottery, which I think is one of the most phenomenal books written about Toronto and about this kind of method of understanding a city. I think of it in a very similar way to Made in Tokyo by Atelier Bow Wow, who George corresponds with quite a bit and who he introduced me to. This way of understanding the city that is actually quite particular, but is able to be extrapolated to other understandings. So with Tokyo, they were looking at the generational subdivision of lots and how that then generates architecture in some ways. And I think George's contribution, which we're seeing now, generation upon generation, is this method of understanding the city. And it was a very really direct understanding of the city, from looking at Toronto as a city between two rivers and between a lake and a historic lake line. It's a very specific understanding, but that is actually more applicable in a wider scale. So I almost wish that book that he did with Barton Myers had a wider audience, because there's a real challenge with George's work where he goes between these poles of extreme specificity, where on building downtown or built form analysis might only be read by planners or by people working in the city department, or he's writing Space of Appearance, which might be a more academic textbook. I think there's that really interesting liminal space of understanding the city in an applicable way is where he got to with Vacant Lottery. And if that the way that understanding was so well articulated was in his pedagogy and his teaching. So whether or not he wrote the perfect book, which in many ways I think that was, it was how he then took that and then taught it to me, to everyone in this room, to many of the people watching, I'm sure. That switch of media, again, that form of public practice within architecture school, has created an entire generation of architects who are able to read the city in a completely different way, and then able to intervene in the city in a way that allows for agency with both the architect and with the public in a really unique way, which I think is quite fascinating. Now, in more direct response to you, Roberto, I think the transatlantic interchange was, again, I think a form of understanding the city that was translated in some ways to a completely different way of reading the city. I mean, in one way, I almost think of that word translation. At the time, there was so much emphasis on semiotics, on the hermeneutic phantom, these ideas of reading architecture. And I think that George's really nuanced understanding of semiotics is a really applicable one, in that it is a translation. It's never a direct, this thing means this. It's always an almost poetic understanding of how semiotics and architecture can be applied. And I think that is something that he directly brought over from Europe and adapted to the Canadian, North American context. I think that might be a good starting point. Hans, I think you might have a few more examples of how George brought some of those ideas over.
Oh, I think this idea of translation is, at least for us, it was really productive to write this article. And I think it relates to what Joan mentioned in terms of hybridization, and Michael in terms of bridging. So there's, let's say, different terms of getting ideas from elsewhere into Toronto. And I think what we could have emphasized maybe a bit more in our contribution is the sociological aspect of this, that the ideas are not existing in some kind of abstract universe, but they are also always located somewhere. And this is related to what you, exactly. And so I think that's, for me, one of the interesting aspects, that the effect of ideas can only be local, ultimately, because you have to be.
Which is that idea, again, of agency with the public and bringing people in to the design, that it's so, it only happens when it's occupied. It's the same with all architecture. It only happens as a stage for human activity.
Yeah.
Is his real understanding of the city.
Yeah, I think what your contribution does is, again, showing how George, in order to be loyal to this idea that architecture is a shared practice, he always try to establish these intellectual connections with people that go beyond Toronto. That's, I think, one of also the amazing thing about your essay, is that your essay draws this map of all the connections that George had from London, from his time in London, then Toronto, then to the GSD, and then all of this kind of international knowledge that he gained help him with shaping his teaching and shaping his writing. Maybe, Brigitte, you can help us with, I mean, since you know George.
Sure. Yeah. So in a way, maybe the whole ability to interrogate the idea of teacher practitioner further is kind of important. I worked in the office for about 5 years, from about 1983 onward. And it was actually at the time that George was also the new acting chair at the architecture school. So he was actually establishing a whole new curriculum at the school, where it shifted from being fully studio-based to actually having studio history and theory, building sciences as actually separate courses. So this was actually a major shift pedagogically in the school at that time. And in a way, it's interesting in Richard's essay with George, because there's a conversation about the teacher practitioner and then a question about the critical practice. And I would probably argue that Baird Sampson Architects, which is George's firm at the time, he basically says there's no critical practices in Toronto at that time when he's talking to Richard. I would probably disagree, and I would probably argue that the office itself, his own office, was actually a critical practice. because in a way there was a kind of, serious research going on at the same time that there were buildings being built. And so this kind of long-standing interest in the vernacular, a whole series of early projects looking at the Ontario vernacular was kind of a research agenda as well as built form. I would say that the whole discussion that Joan initiated about public space was really interesting. And in a way, in her essay, she quotes from Barth that the city is the site for our encounters with others. It's a kind of beautiful kind of statement because it really talks about public space as this place of encounter, and it ties together so many different theorists. But I would say that in the office, there was a competition for Bay Adelaide Park that they won, that they built, and it is in effect a place of encounter. So many of the kind of conceptual ideas that were understood and discussed were actually played out in built form with waterfalls, ramps, alley of trees, that there was a kind of physical sort of realization of all of these urban ideas in built form. And in a way, within the office, something like Bay Adelaide Park resulted in a whole range of butterfly conservatories, other kinds of projects that led to a whole other series of investigation. And that in architecture, we're always in collaboration. So it's really a kind of collaboration between George Baird and Barry Sampson. They were both practitioners together as a partnership, but also educators, because at the same time George was teaching at the school, Barry was also teaching at the school as well and has continued to do so. So, and then, when you think about built work, there's also unbuilt work. So things like the Edmonton City Hall competition was really a competition. It was never fully realized. There was a pretty not interesting building that was actually built, but the competition was really provocative because it proposed saving a modern building, which was the kind of original City Hall, and adding new layers to that building to recontextualize it. So in a way, this issue of practice, critical practice, which is a kind of Frampton term, actually situates, I would say, George's built work in a way that actually, I think, links so directly to his teaching. So when you think about some of the projects that were done in the office, the study of Jarvis Street and those early so vacant lottery actually was part of a discourse where the school itself was actually the student projects that he did with his students at the University of Toronto actually were published in Vacant Lottery. They were part of sharing both the research about Toronto and its built form, but also that the student projects became part of the document. And it really spoke to me about the fact that the work that happens in architecture schools is not some nice little play project that's kind of invented by the instructor, but can actually shape the future of our cities. And that they become, even though they were student projects, they have a life and they have a meaning. And I would say the word agency has been battered around, but I would say that the work that happens in an architecture school through the kind of commitment of people like George and Barry has a kind of agency to actually reshape our cities. And actually that it's not theoretical or hypothetical, it's based on theory and it's based on so much thinking, both European and North American, but it has the capacity to actually literally physically reshape our cities. So for me, that's where all of the, on building downtown and built form analysis and greening downtown for Vancouver, all of those studies, you're focusing on zoning bylaws, setbacks, street widths, but again, it's about reshaping our cities and taking all of this knowledge of urban public space, urban life, and the city, and actually making it real in a really positive way. So I feel like for me, this kind of connection between teacher, practitioner, and critical practice is kind of a combination that I think is really important, maybe unique at the time, but I feel like has kind of reshaped how we can reimagine our cities, both for students in architecture school and then also for practitioners.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think, and I'm sure that about the topic of critical practice, John is sensitive to, and Richard as well. I think so. In the interview,
I have a certain degree of trepidation about it, and I think it's an important issue to discuss, particularly for our students.
yes,
In terms of
that's now I'm getting to the question. So I think in the interview with Peter Eisenman, he pretty much he was extremely skeptical about the success of the critical and the theory generation. So he said the theory generation, which Baird belonged to, as it failed for several reasons, but not just because of some arguments about architecture place in the society, but also because of the broader context has changed and architecture cannot keep up. So my question is for you. So what is, for example, John, what is your take on the evolution of the theory generation, which you were part of and George was part of? So there were so many ambitions there. There was this idea that this new figure of the teacher practitioner or the architect as public intellectual could actually affect city politics. But then something happened, and it's almost like we lost something in the process. So what?
Well, I think, yeah, again, we have to historicize what happened. And I think there was a moment when a kind of synthesis of intellectual activity and practical work in professional work seemed possible and seemed like an avenue that could be pursued. But what happened was a kind of I don't know, commodification of theory that took place on the one hand, and on the other hand, a big boom in building on the other. And there was a split between cultures of theory and practice. And there was also a kind of exhaustion that built up over intellectualization and without being really grounded in real practice. And by the 90s, as the digital entered and work really started to abound, eventually this produced this whole post-critical take on things in which, all we need to do is perform and project, and criticism or criticality is a kind of friction that we don't need. It's a drag on actually making things and doing things. And I think that by the millennium, by 2000 or so, that kind of moment really was the dominant one, and it kind of dealt a death blow to this kind of theory culture that had been emerging since the late 60s. And I think George made a very significant contribution to this debate that was going on with his essay on criticality, in which I think very judiciously he kind of weighs these different positions and doesn't want to, throw out the baby with the bathwater, is kind of saves both sides in a way that and ultimately defends the necessity for a critical culture and a critical position in architecture. And I find one of the last essay in his book, writings on
architecture in the city.
Architecture in the city. Why can't architecture just be happy? Is such a great question to wrestle with. What does architecture need to have this kind of constant negativity? What does critical thought do for architecture? And it seems to me that his own practice and his own work and his own very thoughtful wrestling with ideas over the course of his career really answers that question in itself. On the other hand, he also does believe that architecture and the built environment can give pleasure, can produce a kind of happiness, and he wants to sustain that as well. And so I think that's, you know, it's an interesting or anyway, as I say, judicious kind of compromise that he arrives at that is rather persuasive. If I had to add another B, by the way, to my three Bs, it would probably be Bertolt Brecht, because in relation precisely to this idea of pleasure or happiness. And Brecht sees happiness or pleasure, let's call it, as a political project in a way, and recognizes that, you know, to change anything, to transform a situation, you first have to get people's attention. You have to kind of invite them in. Brecht understood that the theater had to be entertaining, had to seduce, and he speaks about culinary, the culinary dimension of the theater, which maybe for George would be very appropriate as well. So the pleasure that can also be part of a critical project seems to be maybe close to George's own activity, the kind of sustaining both, understanding that both are necessary.
Thank you so much. I see.
Can I chime in for a moment? Because Roberto, I'm surprised that you're so negative about current theory in relation to practice, which really puzzles me, because I think it might be true that a certain generation finished this mode of operation. But if you look at Europe, and if you look at Abelos and Herreros, or Surgeson and Bates, or the whole San Rocco generation, then you cannot claim that there is no interest and no, let's say, creative, productive activity in terms of theory and practice at the same time.
Yes, but I think, I mean, I'm just here as a moderator, so I don't want, but I think to me, it's just like Michael A's, I mean, like the two key books in like to understand the content, I mean, the evolution of architectural theory are John's Architecture Culture and Michael A's collection of theoretical essays, where they're actually claiming that theory is something different. So I think what is happening now in the practices that you are describing are going back to what John's defined just as a culture. So
well,
I don't think that
I think we have to. I don't
yes.
want to revisit ancient problems and ancient history, but and I entirely agree with Joan's sort of very efficient, let's say, historiography of the evolution of this theory and practice culture since the 70s. But there were deep contradictions at the heart of the so-called critical project, at least in North America, of the generation that preceded me. That I would say, you know, the kind of Eisman and Vidler and IA-US generation, and it's connected to a distinction that I think George would make, or a correction. He'd say, well, you know, I'm a teacher practitioner, teacher first, practitioner second. These other people we're talking about, like Koolhaas, are not teacher practitioners. They're practitioners that go to the schools and teach occasionally as part of their career project. And so their pedagogy comes through, and this would be true for Venturi and Scott Brown to some extent as well, through their texts and through the things that they did. The problem for at least the people that were educated by, and I don't put this on George, but for people more like Eisman and to maybe a lesser extent Koolhaas, is their avant-gardism and their position of saying there was a critical architecture which is separate from the rest of the profession, was for them a kind of power move to say that what they did was separate from and different from what SOM did and the other firms did. And they sold us all on this idea, right? This idea that what they were doing was somehow intellectually more sophisticated, it was politically more critical. And after a point, we had a hard time understanding how that was when a lot of their theoretical work was to position themselves in the cultural marketplace. And some of them did it successfully, and many of them didn't. And so that's where this historical cynicism comes from. And Hans, I'm not sure that I agree with you that there are a lot of people who are very informed and sophisticated around questions of culture that are practicing architects in Europe and North America. But I still think this tension between the architect trying to be someone who is a public intellectual and who's critical, like let's say Michael Sorkin, the late Michael Sorkin, tried to become a teacher, critic, practitioner, and then to start to design things, and people just went crazy because they thought he was in a completely compromised position to do this. You can't be a critic and someone who was then positing a kind of project as an architect because he went the wrong way around. So I think there are more problems, or there's more contradictions in the architect as a kind of, let's say, commercial or institutional professional, and the architect as an intellectual than this model often, and I'm only speaking personally as someone who was very seduced by this when I started out, right? Thinking that was a model that would be easy to follow, right?
I think again, I'm here to moderate, but I mean, I can tell you my opinion on this, and I think from this point of view, I think Baird represent almost like another interesting kind of position, because in Baird, there is a connection between writing, theorizing, teaching, and practicing, but this connection is not as straightforward. So at least there is always some kind of critical step that is necessary in order to see the connection across these three different modes of practicing. Something that in his interview, Eisenman saw as a problem. So
what did he see as a problem? Did Eisenman see as a problem?
Yes. So what Eisenman sees is that the lack of some kind of critical continuity or continuity across these different modes of practicing, it can actually be an issue. Where I think what Rossi suggested and what Baird also suggested through his modes of practicing is that there must be a critical step when we try to bridge between writing, theorizing, teaching, and practicing. And that's, I think, what we are pretty much suggesting. Because I think, I mean, Rossi in his first, in the architecture of the city, his idea is that there must be a critical step between theorizing the city and designing the city. So something that then got lost in his practicing, but there was his original ambition in the architecture of the city. And I think it's a project in some way, it's a critical project that George pursued throughout his career. So this idea of keeping these three different modes of practicing connected, but at the same time connected in a critical manner.
Well, and just to point out that the demands of practice and the kind of dimensions and the demands, just again, to speak a little bit more to the students who are in the audience, one of the reasons that this model has been very difficult in the last decades is the professionalization of all of these, I guess I don't know if that's the right word, of all these activities that demand a degree of, shall we say, mastery and intensity, where operating
PhD.
Right, operating in three modes at once is, and actually having a life is actually quite difficult.
Yes. Yeah.
So I didn't mean to speak over you there. I was just mentioning the PhD. The PhD is mentioned a number of times in the book of talking about how if you want to be involved in an academic institution, now all of a sudden you need a PhD. And I think that idea of being a teacher practitioner almost becomes impossible. If you need a PhD, you're going to be spending 10 years doing that on top of a 7-year practice degree. Whereas in North America, it's becoming much more common to be more academic and then maybe do a bit of practice on the side. Whereas in the UK and in Europe, I think as Hans was mentioning, there's still an idea of you practice and you can get a PhD by design, for instance, or you just come into a university environment and you teach a semester or a piece of the curriculum. But I think Eisenman was very critical of Koolhaas, for instance, and his project in the city, that it wasn't as pervasive and revolutionary as we all thought. But I agree with you entirely, Richard, that there's the idea of trying to be a Renaissance person and be above and across all of these things is becoming increasingly difficult as we specialize.
Well, Koolhaas was the canniest of the whole generation because, he operates in this very ironic way, which is that when he's in the academy and when he was, a professor at Harvard, he only came in occasionally and he positioned himself as the renegade and the practitioner. And when he went to China and was seeking work, he positioned himself as the Harvard professor. So it was always in the service of the forwarding of his career and himself as a figure. So he was able to use all of those contexts to the end of becoming this very influential figure, while actually not being fully engaged in any of them.
I must think that maybe it's not so much an issue about how much you're practicing, versus teaching, but rather your abilities to develop theories as an academic that are somehow, relevant to practice. I mean, the thing about some of the Venturi and Scott Brown and Koolhaas, it's like a lot of their engagement with reality in terms of its translation to academia was that somehow theories had to be drawn from reality, like observe the city, extract a theory, and then apply it back to the city as somehow a way of engaging it. And the thing that I think George did so well was it wasn't really, what I always admired about George, it was never so much about kind of extracting a theory from the city, but it always seemed to be about, what are ways of thinking critically about the tools we engage city building with or architecture with. And so, that's why there's always such an interesting relationship between, methodological practices of observation, political theory, and then actual practice. And they always seem to kind of, meld together somehow, even if they're through different essays. I've always found. So I think it's, I don't know how like a full-time academic can still practice in a genuine, real practice sense nowadays. I'm Brigitte, notwithstanding your company, of course, but but even if you aren't kind of fully engaged in practice, I still think it's important to learn maybe that aspect of George's theory building, which is that it can inform practice in a thoughtful way.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of questions from our audience that are all about how George sees this relationship between the agency of the architect and the agency of the dweller, or the urban dweller. So then I think maybe we can, since we are getting closer to the end of this, what I think an amazing evening with all of you, I think it would be maybe we can try to, I would say, project, considering the troubled context we are kind of living in, we can try to project Baird's pluralist thinking on maybe today and the future, and see maybe discuss how we can how George pluralist thinking about public space can help us with addressing some of the issues around agency and the agency of the architect's agency and the agency of the urban dweller.
I might pick up on that on a small point, and I think this is both pick up on what Michael said and what Brigitte was saying earlier about how some of the practice that George did was direct application of theory, and that it was a very sort of almost straightforward understanding of theory, and that you had a sense that there's a real a humility to a lot of the work that is incredibly particular to space. Again, as I was saying again earlier, for instance, the Postman Park, I think it's called, in St. Louis, that George did. I think what is amazing about that is that it's not, you couldn't necessarily look at it and say that's a Baird Sampson Noy project. It's more that is a project that is appropriate for the city. And I think that there's that kind of humility has a real place in that question of agency, because it's not an Eisenman Noame project, an authored project in that way. It still has agency of the architect, but it's still creating a space that is of the city and for the people, that is so much more particular to space than and place than you might have in other contexts. I think that very applicable sense of place building is something that George has been incredibly influential in.
And that's very much I think a Barry Sampson project I want to point out, and in an incredibly charged site near the St. Louis Arch. So that's a fascinating story in and of itself. I want to come back to something that Joan introduced in her essay in the beginning of the talk about this kind of Benjaminian idea of the haptic, and how important this is to George's thinking in this way of reading the city that Michael was emphasizing, that, George is fairly insistent that when you write about something, whether it's a piece of architecture or a public space, you have to go and see it personally. Despite whatever the representations are, that the kind of tactile aspect of the city is incredibly important. This connects to his early work on Alvar Aalto, and I think this is a big part of his influence. So it's not just a kind of cold analytic mapping that we're talking about. It actually has to do with architecture's kind of material life. I think that's very much a part of the DNA of architectural culture in Toronto. But I think, and this is also connects to what comes up in our discussion about the teacher practitioner, and a certain amount of, frankly, Michael, resistance to this idea that the schools will become places where people theorize practice, but they don't necessarily practice, right? And the emergence of the kind of professionalized PhD as the kind of center of a school of architecture, that schools, and this is why I brought up the figure of Charles Moore in our discussion, provocatively, because Charles Moore was never considered a kind of great, he was considered a kind of slightly strange figure within this kind of theorist architect world, but he may have been in that generation the only one to successfully build a practice that actually attached itself, or was literally almost financed by his connection to a series of schools. I don't know if you all know this, but Charles Moore, like, he taught, Joan, where did he taught everywhere? He taught at Yale, he taught at UCLA, he taught at Berkeley, and in every city he established a practice and partners, right? And they built a lot of stuff. So I can't think of anyone else who kind of pulled that off, that made this kind of community between a series of schools, and then also established a kind of travel. It was like a traveling roadshow, right? Where in all these places he managed to also build things. I mean, at a fairly humble scale. I mean, they weren't like huge skyscraper projects, but I can't think of there were lots of people that were influential to me, like Robert Mangurian. There are lots of people who tried to do this too, right? But they never quite got there. And so today, I think the expectations are very different. The marketplace and the way that architectural practice is structured as a commercial enterprise is extremely different. And so I think it's very important for our students and for our school to figure out what the implications are of what you're saying, Michael, that the schools, what ways in which the schools can produce agency for the field, right? Or agency for architects and urbanists.
Can I just bring up one item that, I wasn't a contributor to the book, but I've read it thoroughly, and I thought that it was interesting that in several of the essays, George's sort of connection to Alvar Aalto was brought up, a kind of early writing that he did for a book on Aalto, but I feel that there's a kind of all of the figures of modernism, it's a kind of interesting choice. in Toronto during a kind of the 50s, 60s, Scandinavia was a huge influence. You look at our Toronto City Hall and so many iconic buildings that were really inspired by the work that was going on in Scandinavia. But I think that with Alto, there's sort of it's actually more than just Scandinavian. I think that, you know, the kind of one of the essays with Frampton, there's kind of a debate or discussion about, you know, Frampton being a pure modernist and George being more of a hybrid modernist, but both of them share this affinity for Alto. Of all of the kind of modernist figures that you could pick, Alto is sort of not always the first choice of everyone. And I think it's actually quite interesting that both of them really see within Alto maybe a humanist position, a kind of a kind of optimistic way of seeing the world. And then I would say that the haptic, which was brought up in several of the kind of discussions about how you read the city, you can experience from a door handle or from these aspects of Alto's work that are kind of both embedded in a tiny scale of design and also a vision about what is a city at the same time. And so I thought that that was something that probably could use some more interrogation. It was kind of in, you know, sort of woven in a few essays, but I thought that it was something that is another way of positioning George or sort of, or using it as a kind of reference point within the kind of broad sort of breadth of modernism as a kind of a source of inspiration and a kind of one of the kind of key modernist figures that he typically gravitates to. So I just thought that was a kind of interesting thing that emerged from the various essays that I read.
Thank you, Brigitte. Any other closing comment?
Well, someone asked a funny question about whether the design and construction of our school has anything to do with these ideas, or what the connection is between. Well, obviously, we've talked about the connection between the history of our school.
There is no better person than you, Richard, to answer this.
I mean, of course, George was teaching at Harvard when both, I believe, when Nadir Tirani and I were students there. I don't know if Nadir had his class. I know Laura, my wife Laura, studied with George. I have right here the issue of Oppositions that where George translated the
essay about Karel Tiger.
Carl Teague debate with Le Corbusier about functionalism, which was like really blew my mind and really sort of started my thinking when I was an undergraduate about architecture's relationship to politics, actually, and to the relationship between form and political expression. So I would say that there is, of course, so that there, and then George was our colleague. So I went back to teach at Harvard 10 years after I finished. Nadir was there as well, along with his partner, Monica Ponce-Leon. So we were all teaching together. And so the ideas of, you know, earlier on of typology and then a kind of architecture which engages the city was just something that, well, you know, if we had designed our building and it hadn't sort of had an urban argument about its connection to the city, George would have just crucified us. So the answer is yes, of course. It was, you know, we share an ethos and a culture, you know, also Nadir, you know, I hope he wouldn't mind if I would say this, you know, he's semi-successful at being a teacher practitioner. After all, he's the dean now at Cooper Union. I'm joking because he would say that it's a very tough road. But he's you know, been incredibly dedicated to teaching. And while we were designing One Spadina, Nadir ran a studio at our school and in fact that site. I don't know if the students know this. Before there was the Super Studio, when it was called Metropolis, that site was a site for that studio many times. And then Nadir ran a studio on it at the preliminary stage with students. He also taught a studio at Georgia Tech and other schools. So the project was really emerged out of this you know, like Michael's saying, it was sort of, it was kind of theorized in an academic context.
If I could just pick up on something Brigitte said, and also following Richard here, it may well be that one of George's really most important contributions is precisely his hybridizing of the phenomenological tradition, the material, tactile, haptic world of things, and critical theory on the other hand. And we tend to see these as very much at odds with each other, not possible to put together. And yet following precisely in the lineage of his mentor Hannah Arendt, who does the same, or to some extent the same, in her connection both to Heidegger and to Benjamin. It's possible to make this marriage, or to propose it as a possibility. So I think that will be a very lasting contribution of his, and a very unique one.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I think if we don't have any further comments, thank you so much for joining us today. And so this is the book. Just wanted to show you. So this is, and the book is going to be available through the CCA website from early much this week. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers. And I would also like to thank our Daniels Public Programming Committee for organizing this year's series. To see the rest of the Daniels events this year, just head to the Daniels website and go to News and Events.
And thanks, Roberto.
Thank you, Roberto.
And thanks to George as well.
The book is beautifully done. If no one has said this yet, it has a very serious air about it.
Thank you.
Very elegant.
Thank you. So the next event in the Daniels lecture series is Jason Nguyen tomorrow at 1 p.m. And for our Daniels talk is Takes Action Session 3 on November 11 at 4 p.m. The talk is the final in a series of panel sessions launching the fourth volume of the journal Bracket. So again, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I hope you will enjoy the book. Again,
Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Thanks, George.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great to
Thanks,
see
everyone.
everybody.